We're going to go into some fascinating topics, as I was mentioning, but I'd like to briefly just speak about my background. So first of all, faculty over at Hopkins, coordinator for the graduate program in regulatory science, as well as food safety regulations. Work very closely with the Center for Biotechnology as well. Almost 10 years at Hopkins, and as mentioned, 5 years in private industry, pretty much involved with all aspects of commercializing a variety of medical products spanning drugs, devices, diagnostics, combination products, biologics, supplements, foods, medical foods, so pretty much everything. And prior to joining private industry about 5 years ago, I spent 10 years at the Food and Drug Administration, 5 of which was at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where I specialized in software in medical devices, which obviously is a topic very near and dear to my heart, and one that I will be focusing on this lecture, as well as 5 years at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where I was most recently Associate Office Director for Risk Science, primarily focusing on computerized systems used to support FDA-regulated research, developing policies, had authored a few guidances, trained investigators, and obviously conducted pre-market reviews. Before the agency was at the National Institute on Aging. So it's from this trifecta, if you will, of the industry, academia, and regulatory agency that I'm going to be presenting the topic of understanding the role of software as a medical device within the context of FDA's regulation over these types of products with respect to AI, ML type-based approaches, as well as considerations for software validation and cybersecurity. And what I'd like to do is start with a quote that I feel is very apropos to open the mind, if you will, to recognizing just because whether we're inventors or developers or testers or engineers, we don't always fully appreciate the ripple effects that our concepts and our products will have downstream. And I quote Professor Harari, who is an author that both Bill Gates and President Obama have spoken very highly of, so don't take my word for it. But he speaks of this concept of the emergence of infotech and biotech within our generation, and specifically medicine is the most ripe area for demonstrating the benefits of artificial intelligence and machine learning based approaches. Why specifically? Because when you break it down, it's all about processing data. That's what physicians do. The diagnosis and treatment of medicine comes down to being able to identify the specific information that needs to be taken into consideration to perform the right diagnosis and then prescribe the right accompanying treatment. And he postulates that within the next few decades, we're going to slowly see algorithms, if you will, replace the physicians. And it's going to take a much longer time, I believe, than folks would like to think. And that's because of a few phenomenons, of what's considered the de-skilling in healthcare, right? And we'll talk about that as technology evolves, you're allowing perhaps a lower tier of the healthcare practitioner workforce being able to cover certain areas of healthcare delivery via the technology. And so you see, you know, what nurses are doing today wasn't what they were doing 10 years ago. And likewise, what the doctors are doing today are what the nurses are going to do 10 years from now, and so on and so forth. And there's this understanding and appreciation that there's going to be these quantum leaps, and recognizing, in effect, you know, cloud computing and just the ability to commoditize processing power as we apply this in medicine, and we're going to have specific examples, we're going to start to see a complete paradigm shift. And out of all the industries, what's unique is Professor Harari believes medicine is going to be the one that's going to see the most dramatic changes quickly as possible. And I do believe that, although I still think it won't be as fast as perhaps we all hope. And the objective of this evening is really to focus on the regulatory requirements, not as much the science. So I really hope that the brilliant students will bear with me as I guide you through the very exciting topic of FDA's regulatory oversight of software as medical devices. And I'm not saying this sarcastically, because this truly is going to be the barrier between allowing you all and the greater community to allow technologies to help fulfill unmet clinical needs. It's just building quality into the process, doing it the right way, knowing what are the applicable requirements from the get-go. And then the path is much, much easier, because the pitfall that I've seen time and time again is phenomenal products. Software, always easy to write code and develop it. And look, it works, but you didn't have the right documentation. You didn't have the right processes. And you have to go back and you have to start from scratch. And yes, you basically have to go listen to this recording and understand what are the applicable rules and start to follow the guidances and start to do your homework, and then realize, gee, if I would have just approached it from the inception, recognizing that this applies, this doesn't apply, oh, okay, it will save a tremendous amount of time from the commercialization perspective. And that's what I think the BME-X program really is underscoring, that translational element. So that's the challenge here, is I'm giving you the recipe, basically everything you need, the guide, to develop your software in a way that will satisfy FDA regulatory requirements. The devil's always in the details. There's no one size fits all. But I'm gonna, in effect, I've condensed 3 or 4 of my favorite courses. We have an entire course, Biomedical Software Regulation. I think, as a courtesy, we're happy to have folks attend that as well. But I've tried to condense down a lot of the primary principles into this outline. And so we're gonna start with the FDA Regulatory Framework, define what software as a medical device is, give you some examples of AI/ML-based products that have been cleared and approved by FDA, and then spend most of the discussion talking about the recommendations and guidance. And I'm gonna try my best to keep the pace, stay on time, and I do believe we wanna stop for questions and some polling, so let's get to it. This is the infamous, what I like to call, regulatory triangle, because it's a visual depiction of the spectrum of FDA's regulatory jurisdiction, if you will. And I use the word regulatory so you can appreciate the distinction between a law, which is literally an act passed by Congress, which we'll get into in just a second, versus a guidance, which are a set of recommendations, contrasted with the other end of the spectrum, a policy. So I will try to explain very briefly how the FDA fits in the context of the executive branch of the US federal government, because that's the scope of this evening's lecture. And a full disclaimer that I also teach international regulatory affairs. So if you want to learn about what's happening with the European Medical Agency or in Japan, with the PMDA or Therapeutics Goods Administration in Australia, I could say, it's awesome because in our very program, we actually have representatives from all of the regulatory bodies that through one way or another, either alumni or current faculty at the agency. So again, we're very collaborative over at Hopkins. So I know the folks, if you're really interested in learning more about things beyond just the US FDA and want to better understand some of the international regulatory applications, a lot of data privacy issues that are perhaps even way more stringent than that in the US would apply. And this is apropos to this topic because it's all about access to the data. And you have to appreciate that human subject protection, or otherwise known as data privacy laws, are going to be different across the globe. And just accessing data, even the definition of what's considered de-identified data, is a variable. So it's a little bit of an off tangent. As usual, I go on, but I'd like to keep us back on track and just mention that if you'd like to understand some details beyond the FDA regulatory framework, please reach out to myself or Chuck. So jumping back in, strictly focusing on the US system, there's really this division, if you will, between a law and a regulation. That's what's considered enforceable, right? And there's this inverse relationship. And if I could have, I would have invested in a nice graphic that has this little pendulum that swings, because there is a concept called the political pendulum. Because as you can imagine, as a scientist, it always pains me when, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, scientific issues become politicized. And what we need to do is focus on the information and the processes and the evidence. And we have to understand the system that we're operating in. And so the way it follows is, because the agency is part of the executive branch, at any given time, an executive order could be issued that dictates a policy. For example, an enforcement discretion policy, where the agency still retains the right to enforce certain provisions, but is exercising its right not to, its discretion not to, choose to let's say, not take enforcement action through the Department of Justice, let's say, for certain provisions. So it can change. I was part of the transition, let's say, between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and things literally overnight were changed in terms of the policies and the different priorities that we'd focused on. Remember, agency is a risk-based agency. And as the former associate director for office director for risk science, you always have to apply risk-based principles. And so if you understand and appreciate that anything that's a regulation or anything that's a law must and has to be followed, that's the purpose of the slide. Now, folks have a tendency when they talk about guidance to say, well, it's really just a recommendation. If you drill down into it, it's additional detail beyond the scope of the language of the regulation that can actually help guide you as a company about what FDA is going to expect. So I can tell you that there's a little buyer beware clause in there. If you choose to follow a different path beyond that which is recommended in the guidance, you still have to demonstrate an equivalent outcome. Let me tell you, the amount of effort just to show that this alternative pathway is the same as whatever FDA is saying you should follow is usually more work, and just as hard at best than just following the guidance. Now, certain times there's not going to be guidance, and that's where it gets tricky. So just appreciate that all the regulations that we mentioned, the quality system regulations that are found in 21 CFR, is actually an extension of the law itself. So the way it's written is, if you look in the sections of the 21 CFR, you actually see citations of the Act FD&C itself. And so very quickly, I think it's important to also understand what the legal definition of a medical device is, because the decision flow tree starts with really any product. Are you regulated or not? And the key buzzwords are intent to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, detect disease. So the definition of drug and biologic is pretty much the same as device, except, as you can see, this last provision, which is differentiated by not being metabolized or achieving its primary interaction through chemical interaction. Now, you can also have, of course, combination products that are both, drug device delivery systems. And from an FDA regulatory perspective, you work through the Office of Combination Products within the Commissioner's Office to determine who's going to be the lead center that's going to be reviewed. But for the time being, we have to always follow this process of determining whether the FDA regulatory requirements apply or not by determining if a service or intended use that we'll go through in just a second meets the legal definition of medical device, which is intent to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, detect disease. Okay, so let's now work our way specifically to software as a medical device, right? And irrespective of the means of software delivery, the focus is always on the intended use. I think that's perhaps one of the most important principles of this entire lecture. And this is as follows. There's internet downloads and micro SD cards and electronic programmable read-only memory, chips and everything in between. That's not what's important. What are you saying it's supposed to do? The definition of medical devices really if you're trying to introduce it into what's called interstate commerce. And that's when FDA has jurisdiction to regulate you as a medical product or a medical device itself. So the software is interesting because you can have standalone software products that don't technically cross state lines unless the software itself is being accessed across multiple regions within the U.S. too. So I know there's some attorneys that are on the discussion here. So this is way beyond the scope of this evening's lecture, but it is important to also appreciate these tangential legal and compliance and regulatory considerations beyond just FDA. By the way, there's a slew and litany of different regulators and applicable laws that are going to apply to any commercial entity looking to introduce a medical product into the U.S. market. And frankly, for any international market for that matter. So what I want to really focus on is this concept of, we're talking about not necessarily, software could be an accessory to a medical device, right? It could be a component to a medical device, software in an imaging machine, software as part of a pacemaker. But that's not really what we're talking about when we talk about SAMD or software as a medical device. We're really truly talking about this standalone software applications that are independent of any really hardware. Now, it may indeed, as you'll see, read and interpret imaging and might provide triaging or identification of risky areas, etc. But ultimately, the intended use of the product drives A, whether it's a medical device or not, and then B, what class it falls under. So it's important to, very briefly, I intentionally didn't give myself a slide on this, so I wouldn't spend too much time on it, but you have to understand the basics if you are able to sort of follow the discussion and the regulatory pathway that a product that you might be developing may follow. So there's a 3-tiered classification system, and as a side note, I've included some of the links in this presentation as resources, and I believe Chuck will be sure to circulate them. You can always reach out to me directly if you want additional information. FDA website, believe it or not, is a phenomenal resource. It has tons of information there to tell you. Goes to actually medical device. But in short, there's a three classification risk-based system where class 3 is the highest risk, life-sustaining, limb-sustaining, supporting type of devices. And then on the other end of the spectrum are the lowest class devices, class 1, such as wheelchairs, Q-tips, canes, and Band-Aids, things like that are still technically subject to FDA regulatory requirements in the quality system, in fact. It's just not what's called the pre-production design controls, which we'll get into. And then the large majority of devices actually fall into the class 2 category, which is primarily reserved for what's known as the 510K program. Again, I cannot get into all the details at this time, but in order to appreciate how software as a medical device works, you need to understand that the 510K program works through what's called a substantial equivalence pre-market notification procedure. 510K, as a technicality, is the section in the law, in the medical device amendments, that's referred to, that allows, basically it was May 28th, 1976, that the date the law was passed, and in effect all products that were on the market until that point were in effect grandfathered in. And companies had an opportunity to demonstrate what's called substantial equivalence to that grandfathered product. Now, here was the kicker. You could, as a company, declare substantial equivalence to a predicate device, not the original grandfathered device, right? So then you had this phenomenon known as predicate creep, where you were referencing the predicate and adding a bell and whistle and then referencing another predicate. And then when you looked at the product that's on the market today versus the product that was on the market on May 28, 1976, and they don't look similar at all. And it's a very difficult argument to say that they're substantially equivalent. But it was, again, these incremental changes. So I will stop myself there. Shameless plug again. Chuck has this awesome boot camp course. I think we had the whole workshop on 510Ks, and you gave me 5 minutes here. Didn't even get a whole slide. So, like I said, it's important to appreciate that approximately 90% of the medical devices that go through the pre-market notification pathway, or the pre-market pathway for FDA, are typically 510Ks. And it's, you find a predicate and you show, and you can have these split predicates and multiple predicates where you show it's basically an engineering-based equivalence. Only about, I think the stat is about 10 to 15% of the time does a 510K actually require clinical data. It's typically when you want to expand the intended use and indication for use, and we're going to get into that right now. So, as I mentioned, it's intended use that drives anything. So, whether your software is intended to be used to potentially diagnose cancer versus used to simply help display information in a better format for a healthcare provider to make a decision, are obviously two different examples, ends of the spectrum. And that's what's going to dictate which device category it's going to fall under. And so you have actually examples directly from the IMDRF, and this is formally both recognized by as well as led by the agency. I used to be part of this when this was actually called the GHDF, the Global Harmonization Task Force. But nonetheless, this is kind of, I think, the gold standard, if you will, internationally, for the software expectations as a medical device. You talked about accelerometers and smartphone allowing different displays of information. But I thought the AI based components, software as a medical device, is what we really want to focus on. And so this again comes from a white paper that the agency had issued. And as I mentioned, in that spectrum of, increased flexibility and enforceability, white papers are at basically the policy level. They don't really carry a lot of weight. I would say they're even lighter than a draft guidance document that's not even intended for implementation as a recommendation. So again, how nuanced you want to get into the spectrum, I'd say this is pretty much, in terms of something you're going to get in writing, as light as it gets, but it's something, okay? I want to put you in the mindset of an FDA reviewer, and I'm going to speak from a former experience. You make a decision based on a snapshot in time, right? The study's over. The clinical study's been completed. I, as a former FDA reviewer, had to look through thousands and thousands, of the old days, thousands of pages of information, and had to figure out what was most important and what was really critical, and then finally pinpoint, okay, when you distill it down to, okay, let's say sham in a device study versus treatment. Okay, you had a lot of sham effects. What do we really see? That's right. That's the true treatment effect, just so everybody understands that principle. You typically have to go through a randomized controlled trial, but you say yay or nay, and that's fine. But it's very atypical to say okay to this, but I would also be open to approving it in these future scenarios as well, right? It doesn't work like that. The agency is A, not a consulting agency, and B, is actually a passive agency. I am so proud of being part of, a government agency whose mission is to protect and promote public health. And that's the other side of it, right? It's not just, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to downplay the passive element in terms of review, because there is a proactive element that the agency has of protecting and promoting public health, of engaging with industry and academia, and is really, and I think this is a primary example where the agency does need to get patted on the back for being so forward thinking, because you have to take yourself out of the paradigm shift. Because when it comes to AI, ML based approaches, you need to know that it's dynamic, right? And the challenge is proving what you have is good enough, right? Well, it was funny. I was involved with probably my favorite project that I'm working on in the entire world. And, there's an AI-based approach, and we want to describe it as further optimizing, right? Meaning it's a state of constant improvement. But you need to establish a baseline, and it's so tricky when you're trying to demonstrate, okay, we're good enough as what's considered the gold standard of clinical care right now, but we think we could be even better. Forget about that. All right, you stick with what's established first. You take baby steps, okay? And from an agency perspective, you could see the ability to say, okay, I can tell you that there are certain thresholds in which approval may be granted, but there's a limitation because I don't, it could be anything, right? The size of a lesion, the limit on, a blood test, or some other, again, I'm being very generic here, but this is considered clinically meaningful. This is the threshold. You have to draw a line in the sand, right? 60 is yes, 61 is no, whatever it is. So it's up to the burden, I should say, on the developer, on the manufacturer, to prove that what they've developed, what they have to the agency is good enough, and they have to basically negotiate what kind of wiggle room they have. Because the true AI ML-based approach is going to say, we're going to further optimize ourselves, because as we collect more and more information and we train our algorithm, we're now going to be able to give a more precise and a more accurate diagnosis or delivery or treatment, again, whatever the application is. And so this is that fitting the square peg in the round hole of FDA approves things static in time, but you have to fit that in to an AI ML-based approach that needs to be adaptable. So here's an example, proud to actually have been part of this project, and a few years back, one of the first examples of a true AI-based software as a medical device product. So in effect, it was used to identify potentially high-risk patients in an emergency room setting. Excuse me, as you can see, based on CT scans, CT angiograms. And it's important to appreciate that A, this requires competent human intervention. There isn't any independent diagnosis. This is simply flagging, right? Because I know in the surgeoneering program, they've probably walked through a lot of the different types of surgical procedures, and oftentimes, right, you have to make, I would classify them as risk-based decisions, right? And unfortunately, sometimes they are life or death decisions in the OR. If you're at capacity, you only have certain staff available, and for whatever reason, right, there's just an influx, and you have to figure out how you're going to manage your patient load and how you're going to manage your resources. And this is where I think you're seeing the opportunity for AI to just get in the door, because that's what this is. I think the future is going to be where the platform is on training the algorithms to actually figure out what the diagnosis is, and actually eventually recommend the whole treatment course because they profiled this patient and they already know which outcome is going to be most likely. But that's a whole nother side of the story. But I wanted to, and so for those that aren't familiar, the DEN classification is something called a de novo, which actually I'm not going to get into the technicality of it, but it creates a brand new regulatory category for a device that didn't exist. And so it was issued this de novo, because otherwise you have what's called a K number if it's a traditional 510K, but it's still so if you were to declare substantial equivalence to this product, you would reference the de novo number here. And again, just an example of a software as a medical device in an AI-based setting. And so it really just, this slide further explains this concept of just needing to being able to keep track of what standard of care is as well. Because on the technology side, as long as you use a true life cycle approach, you really have things nice and tight, and I've seen even in agile extreme programming environments, you can build in the right quality system where you're getting the accompanying documentation and testing and VV&T and it's not really bogging you down. So again, I think it's so right. All you have to do, as my grandmother used to say, is do it. And you just have to know what's the formula that's most suitable for whatever application that you're developing is. And so now that you have an appreciation for the agency mindset, hopefully, and you understand now, or hopefully you can define if you're developing a product, what its intended use, what regulatory category it falls under, then you start to slowly are able to fill in the blanks on the direction that you need to go. And it's going to be, I think, a back and forth process with the agency in particular, if it truly is AI ML based. And so just commit to a program, stick to it, do good version control, keep it nice and tight, really just like any other approaches. And I think you'll be just fine. Here's at a high level glimpse, and I'm going to rush through this because I would like to leave some time for open-ended questions. But another shameless plug, I teach validation and biotechnology as a whole course. So we go into a lot of these nuances in much more depth, and again, happy to provide information, you know, to our colleagues over in the BME program. So these are the two highlighted provisions that I wanted to bring to your attention because they explicitly mention software validation. Now, 82030 is perhaps the most special of all the quality system regs because it's the pre-production design control one. Right? This means, and I've always given the analogy, it's like when you have plans to build a building, when you commit to it and you break ground, right, and you get the permits based on that, that's the same equivalent of when you commit to building a medical device and you're going to put it in a human. That's when the pre-production design control provisions apply. It's very important to understand that concept because that's where you have to have design transfer. That's where you have to actually specify what's your intended use. You have to go through risk management and all that. And so again, maybe this is grounds for a future lecture where we can kind of take them through kind of the next phase once they've identified, you know, the path that they fall under. But anyway, the design, the pre-production design controls under 82030 and specifically design validations, you can see require software validation. 82070I is the provision that applies to that used in the manufacturing of software in medical devices. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention the mobile medical apps guidance. As I said, it's irrespective of the means of delivery, the medium. And so the agency just kind of a few years, I mean, I was part of the original working group and had left the agency by the time it was issued. But it identified a few cases and was issued as in a final form in which the agency intends to exercise enforcement discretion, meaning they're not subject to FDA regulation, because they would otherwise be falling under the definition of legal definition of a medical device, like we talked about, intent to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, detect disease. So you could see some examples where they downgraded it, but I think as the quality of, you know, the smartphones, you know, are increasing, even along the imaging, the dermatology space, I know, the ophthalmic space, you know, clearly in the imaging space, it's getting to the point where it's just as good as the you know, hospital grade terminals that they're used to. So, you know, it's all about, you know, making sure you don't compromise the integrity of the image when you're compacting it and sending, you know, so, I mean, again, I don't want to get into the weeds for the geeks here, but you do have to just take into consideration that the higher risk approach, you know, use from a medical perspective, the higher the level of testing and validation and rigor is going to be required. Just keep that in mind. And so it's not just to get out of jail free. Oh, well, it's on a mobile app, so look, I'll fall into the enforcement discretion provision and can get away with anything I want. It doesn't quite fall like that. Again, these are very specific examples, and even so, Class 1 devices still have to technically register and list with the agency and certify under criminal violation that they're going to adhere to all applicable requirements in the quality system, which again still include complaint handling and corrective and preventive action. So again, there's this misnomer that just because you're even exempt from a 510K that you're not regulated at all, and that's completely not true. So sorry, don't get me started. I'm a former device compliance officer. I can't help myself. I will zip through this. This is, the GPSV was a milestone guidance because it pretty much filled in the gap when the quality system was issued back in 1996, what software validation was. And this is the concept. It's really a quality management approach. Keep the defect density as low as possible by preventing them from getting in the first place. And then if they do get in, remove them. right? So you have to have an ability to detect defects if and when they get inserted, and then effectively remove, and then have nice testing to make sure that it's not. Again, I'm talking very high generic level principles because that's what guidances do, right? And so in general, regulatory field terminology is critical. So making sure everybody's on the same page. I've heard even within the same company, folks talk about the same thing using different terms. So whether you're talking about software validation, software assurance, software verification, it comes back to intended use. Explain to me exactly what you're doing, because how one person is defining it may be different than another. And the baseline for the GPSV itself was really consensus standards merging principles across industries like the IEEE, National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so I wasn't part of this back in 2002, but my understanding was they basically had this traceability matrix, and that was and then that was the impetus, if you will, for establishing formal definitions that were then adopted. There's a fascinating case I have about requirements that I just need to share, where the message is software engineers are brilliant, but they need to also know exactly what it is that they need to design. So for example, there was a case where there was a uterine ablation device, and it was recalled because it was severely burning the patients. And when they did a root cause analysis, they defined it as a software error. And when we looked further, we said, actually, that's not the case at all. Getting into the semantics, as I was talking about earlier, about what is truly a software error, because the software was working exactly the way it was supposed to. And just as a little side note, the word bug itself actually comes from the little cockroaches back in the 1950s when they had the mainframes, and they were plugging and unplugging the little plugs, and the bugs would literally get into it, and it would mess up the ability for them to transmit the software. Just a little side note for the technical history buffs here. But again, what is a software bug versus it's a software error? No, it turns out the software itself was doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It was a requirements error. Turns out, I went and did the inspection. The engineer, when they received the build to specs, it was turn device off when hot. So they said, oh, okay, yeah, 150 degrees. That sounds pretty hot. Whatever it was. And so again, it just goes back to clearly articulating exactly what your intended use are, exactly what your requirements are, and you have to build your software to that, and everything follows from there. Again, I literally go into this topic for a whole course, so I just have to stop myself. It comes back to preventing the errors in the first place. It boggles me when companies think, oh, cut corners and save money. No, you're just going to pay for it on the back end. You always want to do things right. Again, you could get from point A to point B driving a Chevy. You don't always need a Ferrari, right? But you still need an automobile. So that's what you need to do. You need to confirm and verify that the efforts that you're employing are truly going to prevent issues from happening in the first place. There's an example of a laser eye surgery device that was operating on a Windows-based PC, and it was burning patients' retinas because it turns out that when it was going to the blue screen of death, in order to hit the emergency button, you need to access the computer system, the Windows-based operating computer system. And so they literally, had to unplug the machine in order to stop it. So this is an example of something like a piece of hardware, like a watchdog timer was actually the solution in this particular case, that after a certain amount of time, it automatically would shut off the lens for that fail mode. Now, of course, the ideal is that situation that never happens in the first place, and you shouldn't be designing systems that are going to be performing ophthalmic surgical procedures with Windows-based operating systems. Enough said. But it's important to appreciate that the agency doesn't prohibit the use of any specific type of technology, right? The burden is always on the manufacturer to demonstrate that their software, that their product conforms, right? And frankly, the other burden is on the agency to prove it. And I was the lonely unsung hero compliance officer that had to take on, cases where unfortunately there were bad players and patients were getting hurt because there were faulty products getting to the market. And you have to go through the process of demonstrating why. And so, a classic example that people always ask is, okay, what about like commercial off-the-shelf programs? Well, are those, what if I want to like customize one of those? Like a classic example is like a drug dosing calculator. You can take an Excel spreadsheet and make it. So there's a device category for that type of product. So you as the manufacturer, depending on what you want to sell, you have to validate. You have to confirm that whatever it is that you are providing the requirements can be consistently fulfilled and specified requirements can be consistently met. That's the essence. And so we're really moving away from source code. I could tell you in my decade at the agency doing, majority of the software reviews, very rarely would I actually go and look at the code itself. And what's I think amazing that's happening before our eyes is I'm seeing my 9-year-old son that's probably going to exceed, my coding capabilities within the next few years, because everything is drag and drop GUI graphic user interfaces. That's why I talk about this. I don't know if you're familiar locally based Appian, but it's these it's all about functionality. What do you want to do? It's not about, do you know C#, do you know Python, do you know JavaScript anymore? That's not what's important. What do you need to do? Right? Now you have certain constraints on the data formatting, etc. But I think that's the environment we need to start thinking about, right? It's about functionality and intended use. How are you proving it's going to work? What kind of level of evidence do you have, right? And depending on the claims that you want to make, depending on the applications, the level of risk is going to vary. And so really, the validation approach is unique. It's just as much of art as it is a science, but you use and you leverage the information that's available to you to build off of, right? Why reinvent the wheel? So your product that you're developing is going to be validated in a different way than even someone else's product that's similar to yours. But again, are there lessons learned that could be applied? You just have to do the homework, right? Scour the research publications, create little tables, do competitive analyses, figure out, you just have to live and breathe it. I don't, right? It's just like anything in life, I guess. What I found is, the good old days when you could just go to conferences and just, talk to people and meet people. I guess it's now becoming these virtual sessions. So that is something to really consider. I have to admit, I found extremely useful just as I would immerse myself in any topic, right? Software and medical devices or, validation, etc. We're going to have to now be more resourceful in accessing and networking in these virtual channels. And remember, it takes really a village to get these products approved, right? So you could be the brilliant inventor, but you're going to need to have a great team with you. And that's imperative to appreciate. So it's really good to get to know people, to get to know the gold standards. This is just tips of the trade here, folks. So as we're kind of just wrapping up here, hierarchy of software guidance is the validation guidance really talks about the activities to do, right? It even goes into like things like black box testing. I was giving examples, of commercial off-the-shelf software programs that are not regulated as devices out of the box because its intended use doesn't meet the legal definition, but someone could take it and custom tailor it and then sell it as such, and then it would be used. So the software validation guidance is going to say, okay, well, you don't have access to the code, so apply a black box validation test. Or if you are doing bespoke, coding or software validation, etc., use white box, etc., from the ground up. And I think that's going to be extinct sooner rather than later. Excuse me. But now I'm just going to quickly just highlight the pre-market guidance that focuses on the content of the documentation to submit. And again, it's a risk-based model. So everything is driven, just like there was 3 classes of risk with medical devices, so too with level of concern, there's basically high, medium, and low. And so it basically will dictate to you how much documentation needs to be included in your pre-market submission. And this is already assuming that you've met the legal definition of a medical device and you want to commercialize your product into the market. Okay, so you actually start from your way at the top and work your way down. by asking the questions. It's always assuming this is before you've actually mitigated any of the potential hazards, right? Does it have any potential to cause either death or serious injury? If the answer is yes, the software automatically falls into the major level of concern, and you have to submit basically these 12 sections of documentation that include basically whole kit and caboodle, traceability matrices, software requirement specs, hazard analyses, XYZ. Now, if the answer is no to the top question, then you go down to the moderate level of concern, right? And then the question becomes does, before mitigation of any hazards, there be any possibility of a failure of the device causing a minor injury? If the answer is yes, then you fall into the moderate category. Only if you've answered the first two questions no, then could you fall into the category of minor level of concern, and there's more limited information in the documentation that is submitted to the FDA in your pre-market submission. This brings me to my last slide, which is just almost like a footnote, if you will, because as we talk about network devices, especially the folks at Hopkins, it's important to appreciate there are threats, right, that are very imminent and real that we need to protect against. This is for everything, for the sake of our patients, for the sake of our products, for our own privacies. And so, it's that trade-off that, in one of my lectures, I talk about how, sometimes, even though it's annoying when my, password strength, when I type it in again and again, it's a bit encryption layer, right? It protects against that brute force attack of, whatever permutations, can break it down. Because we've all had, or many of us, I should say, have probably been unfortunate victims of, email hacks, etc. And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to, very weak password strengths. And if you truly encrypt, your passwords, and you apply the right encryption standards and approaches, etc., you're not always immune from attacks, but it's a very good safeguard against it. And so, right, two-form authentication, something you have, something biometrics are becoming very, very commonplace. Now, the cybersecurity guidance itself really just talks about within a network itself, or a medical device that's connected to a network. That's the key too. A lot of even implantables themselves, right, need Wi-Fi, need Bluetooth, and are going to have, not just compatibility, but again, encryption and protection against, and it's also not just intentional, but unintentional harmful consequences. You got to make sure still it's able to operate. We've seen cases, unfortunately, where it's so secure that it doesn't work, right? You've applied so many levels of security that for whatever reason, the networks that's supposed to protect you is actually preventing your product from working in the first place. But I provided a link to the guidance itself. It really always depending on the environment in which you're using. Again, if it's a device that's employed globally, or if it's a hospital network that you're talking about, that's going to dictate the level of cybersecurity threats, of course, that you're facing, as well as protection that you need. I didn't even really get into the whole application of different kinds of training algorithms and AI/ML based approaches. I kind of dived more into the regulations. That was the small nugget of science that I was hoping to sprinkle in there, right? We've typically seen what's called the 2/3, 1/3 approach, where you basically train your algorithm on 2/3 of the data, but then you prove it on 1/3, or seen it split with 70, 15, 15. 70% of the data, and then 15 you actually test it, and then 15 you tweak it, and then 15 you prove it. But anyway, folks, I just want to be mindful of the time. We have 5 minutes to go. Chuck, I'll pass it over to you, as well as Dr. Sigurdsson, and see if perhaps we have to open up the floor to any questions.
There was a question there about slides, and Jonathan, you'll provide us with the slides, and we'll just post them.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's it. And so, yeah, as usual, Jonathan, thank you for pushing a full semester course into 1 hour. We really appreciate that. With that, if there's any questions, with only 5 minutes, if you want to unmute and ask the question, if there's a conflict, we figure you'll resolve it. So any questions? Shane looked like unmuted.
Hello. I have a pair of questions. I was wondering how you selected a career at the FDA in the first place.
Sure. So you got to realize, number one, full disclaimer, I am not a paid spokesman for the agency. I swear to you, I thought I was going to retire there. It is the absolute best place. I can send you the links. There's something called the FDA Commissioners Program. That's a good place to start. There's the Medical Device Fellowship Program. That's actually how I originally came in. If you want to be so bold, you can actually apply. They are indeed hiring. I know the hiring folks. Reach out to me. Indeed, trust me. Dr. Seward's and Dr. Montague remind me always that the BME program is the #1 BME program in the world. So I know you're all geniuses, so happy to help facilitate anything. But there's something called usajobs.gov. For those that aren't familiar, you can actually sign up for alerts. These are typically for more permanent positions at the agency. So again, I, of course, worked my way in via an internship that was eventually converted into a full-time position. And so I think, again, whether it's the commissioners, and then each center has their own unique programs as well. But I'd say, BME, program students, devices is a great place to start. Truly is like, in my mind, the dream scenario. I mean, the most brilliant people, the entire world in medicine concentrated in a single campus. I mean, I'm very fond of my experience there and highly recommend it to anybody that's interested.
Kirby, do you want to unmute?
Sure. So my question was, I've got a bit of an entrepreneurial streak, I like to think, at least. And so I was curious, what's your kind of advice for inventors or founders, or maybe, some common pitfalls that you've seen that, screwed someone over as far as regulatory goes?
Oh, great question. So I think is really just the basics, right? Like even like protecting yourself with IP. It's just the whole translational part. I mean, really, it's just talk to Jeff and Chuck. They're gonna guide you in the right direction. I mean, there's just of course, myself as well. You can reach out anytime, but I mean, there's just the basics that you have to follow of knowing, like I said, what category you're going to fall under. What pathway do you have to take? Maybe there's some options available to you that, you can get to market quicker and you have to compromise, let's say, on some of the intended uses, and you didn't know that up front and you went down a more, let's say, arduous path. And then, you want to pivot. So I'd say it's really, before kind of committing to going down a path, making sure you've done your due diligence to know, are there any blind spots? And again, it's living and breathe, right? Assuming we all have common sense enough, you just got to live and breathe. You do enough diligence to know what's out there, what's the competitive intelligence, what's my pathway. You become resourceful, you ask information, you do your research, and then you just kind of go step by step. And I don't know, is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay.
One of the things that Jonathan mentioned in his talk is you've got to be careful about your indication, because your indication will lead you to what regulatory pathway is. And that's an entrepreneurial, and we can help you with that, and we'll certainly send you to Jonathan as soon as you confuse us. So
Chuck, I saw perhaps the most amazing question, which is, how do you apply the laws of simplicity to regulatory science? I can be poetic if you'd like.
Sure.
It's a minimalist approach. Less is more. Focus on what's most important. Understand what it is that you're really trying to do. When you answer that question, it becomes clear because you're able to remove the unnecessary. Remember this, the definition of perfection isn't when there's nothing left to add. It's when there's nothing left to subtract. And so really focus on how can you make the biggest impact in medicine as quickly as possible. And even if you got to compromise and you can do more later on down the road, map that out. It's that simple. Figure out what it is that you want to do and what's the quickest way to do it.
Well, it's 5 o'clock, so thank you, Jonathan. There are other applause in the background here, and that's.
I know, it's a shame I'm not there, and then you can take me on the tour, and I can see all the new surgical equipment.
I think we can do better. Everybody unmute and just shout thunderous applause, like the old days. Everybody unmute.
Thank you.
Oh, way to go. Thank you, Jonathan. We can do this.
So, Jonathan said he can stick around a little bit longer, but I wanted to end it at 5. So thank you for coming. If you, I see a lot of names, we've got this. If you want to be on a distribution list and you're not a PhD or a master's student who are going to get it regularly, send me your email and ask to be put on the list, and I will be happy to add you to the distribution list. The slides will be posted. They will be on the Carnegie website, Carnegie Center for Surgical Innovation site. We're getting that up now. So in the next, probably by next week, we'll have the slides and recordings for all of our presentations. So again, thank you, Jonathan. If there's any other questions, just feel free to unmute and ask questions. We'll hang around for a couple of minutes.
That's right. And my email address is included on the slides. As always, reach out. And of course, I really mean about the shameless plug for the regulatory science program, the courses you guys want to take. I'll work it out. We'll get you guys free access, whatever materials you want. I pretty much teach every course, the entire program. We'll figure it out together. We just want to make sure that, you know, we're helping support you guys as much as possible.
And if you can't tell from that enthusiasm that you heard in the last hour, he does mean he will help.
My pleasure. This is the best. Without